The cabin lights of Delta Flight 817 dimmed, casting a soft glow across the rows of passengers. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of dark clouds punctuated by distant lightning that flashed like ghostly strobe lights. Row 22, in the center of the plane, was quiet. She leaned into the window, her travel pillow pressed against her neck, her hair falling in loose strands across her face. A paperback rested open in her lap, its pages slightly crumpled from restless fingers. For all intents and purposes, she looked like any other weary traveler, a woman in a soft gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, clutching the semblance of normalcy in a world that demanded it. The flight attendants moved efficiently along the aisle, smiles polite but automatic. One bent slightly to help a mother with an upset toddler. Another handed out blankets to passengers tucked in for the night. The soft clink of coffee cups and the low murmur of voices created a gentle cocoon of ordinary life. She barely noticed, focused on pretending to sleep. She had become an expert at blending in, a chameleon who could disappear in plain sight. The plane lifted higher, engines humming in a steady rhythm that could lull anyone into a false sense of security. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the vibration of the cabin lull her toward sleep. Memories flickered unbidden across her mind, the months of training, the missions no one could ever know about, the faces of people who owed their lives to her skill, all hidden behind the mask of an ordinary civilian life. In row 22 she was nothing special, or at least she hoped. A soft jolt from the turbulence nudged her awake. She glanced out the window at the stormy night, the lightning illuminating the horizon like a jagged scar across the clouds. A shadow of unease crept into her chest. Something in the air tonight felt different. She tried to shake it off as fatigue, but her instincts, honed over years of high-stakes missions, were already sharpening. Then, unexpectedly, the calm of the cabin fractured. A crackling voice came through the intercom, cutting through the low murmur and the hum of the engines. "Is there a Delta Force sniper aboard?" The words were almost surreal, yet sharp as a bullet. Her heart skipped, then surged. She froze, her paperback sagging slightly in her lap. Passengers around her murmured in confusion, some chuckling nervously as if it were a joke, others glancing around with growing concern. Flight attendants exchanged anxious glances, whispering into headsets. She knew better. This was no random call, no mistake. The calm life she had tried to cling to for so long, the anonymity, the quiet normalcy, was cracking in the cold air of the cabin. Her eyes scanned the rows. Men, women, children, all seated with varying degrees of awareness, oblivious to the undercurrent of danger now threading through the plane. She leaned slightly forward, pretending to read, while her mind raced. Memories flickered across her mind like a rapid slideshow. Years in specialized training camps, desert operations where she moved undetected through hostile territory, sniper missions that required patience beyond comprehension. People who called her Row 22 had long since known her real name, her real purpose. Here, she was supposed to be invisible, but the pilot's words had shattered that illusion. Outside, a flash of lightning reflected across the windows, briefly revealing the cramped aisles and anxious faces. Her fingers curled lightly around the armrest. Every instinct screamed at her to stay calm, to maintain the illusion of a sleepy, ordinary traveler. Yet her breathing quickened, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. Passengers were starting to notice. A man in business attire looked around nervously, whispering to his companion, "Did he really just say that?" A teenage girl clutched her tablet, eyes wide, while a mother tried to soothe her child without drawing attention to the escalating tension. The cabin was still, but a silent ripple of unease passed through every person. Her training kicked in automatically. Every sense sharpened. She mapped escape routes in her head, located potential weapons or obstacles, calculated distances and timing. Every movement of the plane, every flicker of the cabin lights, every subtle shift of the passengers became part of a larger, invisible grid of threats and opportunities. And then she saw movement, a shadow at the far end of the cabin near the rear. Someone was walking slowly, deliberately, scanning the rows with purpose. Her pulse quickened. This was no ordinary passenger. The instincts that had been dormant for years now screamed at her in unison. Danger was close, immediate, and precise. A flight attendant approached her row, whispering into a phone with furrowed brow. She caught snippets of the conversation, words like warning, high risk, and Delta Force. Her stomach tightened. The mundane flight, the routine journey across the country, had transformed into something far more dangerous than any civilian could imagine. She adjusted herself in her seat, shifting her weight subtly, trying to remain inconspicuous. Her eyes never left the aisles, tracing every movement, every flicker of shadow. The passengers remained unaware, but she felt the tension building, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. The storm outside intensified. Thunder rattled the fuselage, and flashes of lightning illuminated the interior, casting long, sinister shadows across rows of anxious travelers. The plane trembled, not just from the storm, but from something far more calculated, far more deliberate. She breathed slowly, forcing calm into her body, every muscle ready to spring into action. The pilot's words had been a signal. Now the game had begun. She wasn't just row 22 anymore. She was a sentinel, a hidden protector in plain sight. Every second mattered. Every decision carried consequences beyond the ordinary. And then the voice returned, this time closer, coming over the cabin intercom with a low, urgent tone. "Row 22, we need you now." Her heart lurched. All pretense of normalcy shattered in an instant. She pressed back into her seat, feigning sleep, but her mind raced with the possibilities. Who had called for her? Who was the threat? And what had followed them onto this plane, turning a simple flight into a battlefield? She swallowed, trying to steady her racing pulse. The storm outside was fierce, but inside the cabin another storm had begun, one she could not avoid and one she could no longer ignore. Her eyes darted toward the approaching figure at the rear, the shadow growing larger with each deliberate step. Her hand brushed the armrest, searching, calculating. This was no drill, no training exercise. Real lives were at stake. And in a moment, row 22, the quiet, nondescript traveler, would have to decide whether to remain hidden or to reveal the lethal truth she had carried in silence for years. The plane jolted sharply, throwing some passengers against their seatbelts. A mother cried out, a child whimpered, and the cabin descended into murmurs of confusion. But she did not flinch. She could feel the weight of the moment settle across her shoulders, the storm outside, the tension inside, the unspoken knowledge that this flight would not end normally. She took a deep breath. The paperback in her lap was irrelevant now, the cozy hoodie and sneakers a mask she no longer needed. In row 22, she was something else entirely, and as the shadow at the rear approached, her eyes narrowed. The intercom crackled once more. "Delta Force, we're counting on you. Row 22. And in that instant, she knew the ordinary flight had ended. What followed would be far from ordinary. The cabin felt smaller now, tighter, charged, as if the very air had thickened. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering anxiously, their voices trembling with the confusion and fear sparked by the pilot's unusual announcement. But in row 22, she forced herself to remain still. Stillness was a form of power. Stillness let her see what others missed. The shadow near the rear of the plane moved again, closer this time. Not hurried, not afraid, purposeful. Her trained eyes tracked the gait, steady, balanced, deceptively casual. A man in his mid-30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a navy windbreaker and carrying a clipboard as if he belonged to the crew. But he didn't look like a crew member. His stride was too assertive, his posture too controlled. He wasn't walking the aisle, he was assessing it row by row. She'd seen that posture before, too many times in too many unstable corners of the world. Her pulse thudded quietly in her chest as she kept her breathing slow and even. She slipped one hand onto her paperback, pretending to read, while the other settled lightly against her thigh, the starting point of a defensive movement if she needed to strike. A flight attendant approached the clipboard man with a nervous smile. "Sir, can I help you find your seat?" He smiled back wrong, too measured, too calm. "No," he said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Her muscles tightened. The attendant blinked, then took a small step back. Something in his eyes must have unsettled her, just enough that she lifted her phone to her mouth and quietly whispered into it, passing along a message she didn't want overheard. Near the cockpit, another flight attendant was on the phone as well, her expression pale. She kept looking toward row 22 with growing urgency. She knew they knew. Her cover wasn't just slipping, it was being stripped away. The plane rattled with turbulence again, but this time she knew it wasn't nature alone. Either the pilot was struggling with the storm or someone had already tampered with the aircraft. She scanned every detail. The storm outside, the suspicious man, the anxious attendants, the pilot's cryptic call, the shifting weight of the cabin as if something, or someone, moved where no one should be. She couldn't yet stand. Acting too soon could trigger the danger before she understood all of it, but she needed to see more. She leaned slightly forward, adjusting her seatbelt to give herself more mobility. Her eyes never left the clipboard man. He was only a few rows from her now. Row 28. Row 27. Row 26. Passengers shrank in their seats as he passed, sensing something, maybe not danger but tension. A mother hugged her toddler. A businessman straightened his tie in nervous reflex. A teenage boy lowered his earbuds, watching with wide, curious eyes. And then he reached row 24. She kept her posture relaxed, but her heart beat hard enough that she wondered if he could hear it. He paused as if sensing her gaze. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head, scanning the rows but not randomly. He was searching for someone, not something. Someone. Her stomach tightened. He was looking for her. Her identity was sealed, classified, erased from systems outside the Pentagon's deepest vaults. If someone knew she was here on this flight, they had penetrated the most impenetrable database on American soil. Only one type of operation did that. An insider threat. The man looked down at his clipboard again, flipping a page. Her breath stilled. The page wasn't a flight manifest. It was a dossier, thin, precise, identifiable. Her dossier. Her pulse pounded as the man looked up again, this time directly toward her row. His gaze swept across row 22, landing on her briefly, 1 second, maybe 2, and she felt a knife's edge of recognition pass between them. Not recognition, as in familiarity. Recognition, as in confirmation. He continued his way forward, but the calm facade he wore cracked for a microsecond, an almost imperceptible lift of a corner of his mouth. He had found his target. "Sir." She sank into her seat slightly, brain racing. How had they tracked her? How did they know she'd be on this flight? A last-minute booking, paid with a burner card, originating from a location chosen specifically because it was unpredictable. Her mind pieced it together rapidly. Someone had access to her real identity. Someone had intercepted flight records. Someone with power. At the front of the cabin, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom again, softer now, tight with fear or urgency. She couldn't tell which. "Row 22, if you can hear me, please identify yourself." Passengers gasped. A few heads turned toward her. The mother with the toddler blinked at her, seeing only a tired woman in a hoodie. She didn't move. The clipboard man glanced up toward the cockpit, eyes narrowing. He heard it too. She needed time, seconds, not minutes. Time to assess. Time to act. Time to understand if the threat was just this one man or if more shadows hid within this flying metal tube. She exhaled slowly, her hands flexed silently. Then the plane lurched violently to the left. Screams filled the cabin as overhead bins rattled. Oxygen masks trembled and drinks spilled onto tray tables. The storm outside lit the windows like a white explosion. People thought it was turbulence, but she felt it. This wasn't turbulence. It was sabotage. The clipboard man braced himself easily, unaffected by the sudden shift. Another tell. He was trained. Another flash of lightning revealed a second figure near the rear of the plane, a hooded silhouette leaning against the bulkhead, positioned perfectly to block access to the emergency exit. Too calm, too still, too focused. A partner. Her blood chilled. This wasn't a random threat. It was a coordinated infiltration. She shifted subtly in her seat, preparing to stand. A flight attendant reached her aisle just then, her face pale, voice trembling. "Ma'am," she whispered urgently, "the captain, he says you need to come forward, please, now." Eyes were on them. She felt them, burning holes through the illusion of normalcy. She offered the faintest nod. Before she could stand, movement caught her eye. The clipboard man turning, now fully alert, his gaze fixed on her with predatory precision. She froze. He had recognized the nod, recognized the urgency, recognized her. The storm flashed again, illuminating the aisle in a silver streak. His hand dipped into his jacket. Not for a gun. Not yet. For a signal. A silent alert to his partner. The second figure near the rear straightened. Passengers were oblivious, busy clutching their armrests or calming crying children. But she saw everything, heard everything, felt everything. She rose slowly, as if just stretching her legs like any tired traveler. But inside, she was calculating angles, trajectories, distances, the closest hard surfaces, the weight of her shoes, the location of the nearest galley, the positions of both infiltrators, the timing of the storm shaking the aircraft. Her thoughts were weapons. And then, ping! The clipboard man received a reply on a hidden device in his jacket. His eyes met hers. Cold, certain, predatory. He knew exactly who she was. Exactly what she was. Exactly why she was dangerous. And in the next second, he took one slow step toward her. Just one. But it felt like the entire plane shifted with him. Passengers continued gasping at the turbulence, unaware that the real storm had just stepped into row 22's aisle. Then the cockpit door cracked open, just an inch. A single voice, urgent and terrified, whispered down the aisle. "Sniper now." She stiffened. Her cover was gone. Her enemies knew her. Her allies needed her. And the plane held 187 innocent souls, suspended 30,000 feet in the air. The aisle had turned into a battlefield. Part 2 ended. And she had not yet even taken her first step forward, a quiet panic. The aisle seemed to stretch into eternity, a narrow corridor suspended between two worlds, one where she could still fade into anonymity, and one where she was forced to become what she once swore she'd never be again. The clipboard man's quiet step toward her felt like a trigger pulled in slow motion. Passengers were still absorbed in their own fear of turbulence, oblivious to the far greater danger creeping through the cabin. Her heart hammered, not with panic but with calculation. Every sense sharpened. Every detail became a piece of a larger tactical puzzle. One threat in the aisle. One by the rear exit. Possibly more unseen. A compromised aircraft. A storm battering the fuselage. A cockpit calling for her specifically. She couldn't act too early, not too late. Timing was everything. The clipboard man took another step, his expression calm, almost friendly, but his eyes gave him away, flat, dead predator eyes. He angled his body slightly, shielding his movements from nearby passengers. He reached into his jacket again. She tensed. He withdrew a pen. Not a weapon, not yet, but held like one. He smiled as if to reassure a nervous passenger, but the pen's metal glint told her everything: spring-loaded, refillable, easily modified to become a shiv or a dart dispenser. She had disarmed men with less. Her fingers brushed the edge of her tray table, inconspicuous, ready. She took one breath, then another. The tension thickened. Before anything could escalate, a sharp cry erupted 2 rows behind her. A suitcase had fallen from the overhead bin during the turbulence and hit a man squarely on the forehead. He slumped forward, dazed, as his wife screamed his name. Passengers panicked, twisting in their seats, creating chaos. Flight attendants rushed forward. Someone pressed the call button repeatedly. In the confusion, the clipboard man leaned closer to her, whispering so quietly she barely heard him. "Agent Hale." Her blood went cold. No one on Earth, not civilians, not commercial airlines, not even law enforcement, knew that name. It had been erased years ago. He stepped back slightly, as if satisfied with the fear flashing through her eyes. "I've been looking for you." She swallowed hard, masking her reaction with a sleepy stretch, as though waking from a nap. He tilted his head slightly. He knew she was alert. He knew she was preparing. And she knew he was ready. A loud thud sounded from the rear of the plane, too heavy to be bags shifting, too deliberate to be turbulence. The second figure near the exit stiffened, hand disappearing beneath his jacket. Passengers still had no idea. A woman screamed as the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into near darkness before the emergency lights glowed faintly along the aisle. Shadows jumped and twisted in the red-tinted glow, casting eerie silhouettes across the seats and walls. Then came the sound she feared most, the faint, unmistakable click of metal against metal, not a firearm, something worse in close quarters. A blade. The clipboard man was no longer pretending. Her muscles coiled. She kept her voice low, steady. "This plane is full of civilians. You don't want this fight." He smiled again, this time with genuine delight. "That's precisely why I do." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face with harsh white light. For just a moment, she saw the scar beneath his chin, a jagged line she recognized from a classified dossier. Her body tensed instinctively. Viktor Reznik, former Spetsnaz, connected to black market weapons rings. Vanished 3 years ago. Presumed dead. But not dead. Standing right in front of her. Dread crawled through her spine. If he was here, then the mission wasn't about hijacking or simple assassination. It was personal. The plane jolted again, and the frightened screams of passengers almost drowned out the sound of Victor stepping closer. But she heard him. She always heard the danger others missed. "We don't have to do this here," she murmured quietly. He leaned in, voice low and venomously calm. "We do, and we will." Her mind raced. She needed leverage, distraction, advantage, anything to break the stalemate. The cockpit door cracked open again. This time she saw the captain's eyes, wide, terrified. "Please," he whispered. "We can't hold them out much longer." Another shock hit her chest. Them. More than the 2 she'd already identified. Her pulse quickened. Who else? Where? A sudden metallic clang echoed from below, beneath the floor panels, near the cargo hold. Her hands tightened. That wasn't possible unless someone was already inside the aircraft structure. Her instincts screamed. They were trying to access the avionics bay. If they breached that area, they could cripple communications, override systems, force a diversion, or worse. She needed to act now. She rose to her feet slowly, ignoring the passengers glancing nervously at her. Calm, controlled, a tired traveler stretching her legs. Victor mirrored the movement, blocking the aisle subtly. "You won't get far," he whispered. She didn't respond. Her mind was too busy calculating the next 3 moves, and the next 30. The storm outside boomed so loudly, it vibrated the overhead panels. A cup rolled down the aisle. Someone sobbed softly. A child whimpered. And through it all, Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "Tell me," he murmured, "how did you ever think you could hide from me?" She met his gaze, her voice unwavering, controlled with terrifying precision. "Because all the people who came after me died before they could get this close." His smile vanished. He moved. Fast. But she was faster. She shifted her weight, letting Victor's arm slide past her shoulder as she twisted sideways. The modified pen skimmed her cheek by millimeters, slicing the air in a whisper. She crashed her elbow into his ribcage, using the narrow aisle to limit his range of motion. The passengers screamed. Someone shouted, "Stop, what are they doing?" Others ducked, thinking it was just another moment of turbulence. But one woman in row 23 stared at her with shock so deep it bordered on revelation. She held eye contact for half a second. Long enough to know her cover was gone. She grabbed the tray table edge and slammed it upward into Victor's wrist. His pen flew out of his hand, bouncing onto a seat, causing a man to yelp in surprise. Victor staggered, but not far. He absorbed pain like a stone absorbed rain. "Still quick," he muttered darkly. Another thud came from beneath the cabin floor. They were running out of time. He lunged again, this time aiming for her throat. She deflected, rolled her shoulder, trapping his arm between her elbow and rib. Pain radiated up her arm, but she ignored it, pivoting to shove him back into row 24. Passengers scrambled away, shouting. The second figure at the rear rushed forward. Now it was 2 against 1. She braced. Passengers ducked, flight attendants screamed. The cockpit door slammed shut in panic. Her vision narrowed to the 2 advancing figures. The plane lurched, sending everyone swaying, but she rode the movement like she'd trained for it. Victor cracked his knuckles. The other man drew something metallic. The aisle was closing in. "Agent Hale," Victor said quietly, "your time is up." She stepped back 1 row, her breath steady. She had assessed the threats. She had identified the danger. Now it was time to act. Her hood fell back slightly, revealing the steely resolve in her eyes. "I don't do up," she said softly. "I do done." The second man lunged. The lights flickered violently, and the cabin erupted into total, blinding chaos. Passengers would later swear the entire temperature of the aircraft changed the moment Ray spoke those 9 words. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and she didn't bark like some Hollywood action hero. She was calm, controlled, deadly steady, a tone you only get from someone who had frozen in a sniper hide for 72 hours without blinking. But row 22 wasn't a battlefield. It was a cramped jet cabin lit by cheap overhead LEDs and humming with recycled air. Still, her voice changed everything. The businessman beside her swallowed. The mother with the toddler instinctively pulled her child close. And somewhere up front, a man in row 11 sat rigid, one leg jittering, eyes darting toward the cockpit every few seconds. Ray had already noticed him. She didn't stand yet, she didn't reach for anything. She simply let her training settle into her muscles the way a pianist returns to the keys after years away. Her pulse slowed, her breathing leveled, and she scanned. Hands, eyes, posture, sweat patterns, micro-twitches. The plane's PA crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot said, voice steady but strained, "we're experiencing a minor technical issue. Please remain seated." Ray almost laughed. Minor technical issue, right. She leaned subtly to get a better look down the aisle. The trembling guy in row 11 wasn't listening to the captain. The man was watching the cockpit door with a predator's anticipation. Ray recognized the posture. She held it herself during hostage recovery missions. Knees slightly bent, chin tucked, fingers twitching near pockets that held something heavy. Not a gun, she guessed. Something more primitive, something that didn't need metal detectors to fail. "Ma'am," the businessman beside her whispered, Do you know what's happening?" Ray didn't answer. She wasn't supposed to be this person anymore. She wasn't supposed to step into these moments. That life was behind her, folded away with her uniforms and diplomas and medals she never displayed. She worked in a hardware shop now, sold drills and garden hoses. Her hands smelled like cedar, not gun oil. But as she watched the man in row 11 twitch with growing agitation, she knew something no one else on that aircraft understood yet. He was working up the courage to move. And there had to be a reason. The pilot had asked over the PA if there was a Delta Force sniper aboard. The flight attendant, Maria, according to her name tag, walked briskly down the aisle, pretending to collect trash to avoid raising alarms. She stopped at Ray's row, offering a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am," she whispered, leaning close, "the captain needs to talk to you." Ray nodded once, keeping her posture relaxed. "Not yet." Maria blinked. "He said." "I heard him," Ray murmured. "If I stand right now, that man in row 11 will too." The attendant stiffened. "Which man?" Ray didn't point, didn't look. "Just keep walking, don't look nervous." Maria swallowed and moved on, but a trembling in her hand betrayed the fear she carried. Ray exhaled slowly. She needed more intel. The cabin wasn't panicking yet, but tension had started crawling through the rows like an invisible ripple. People sensed something was wrong even without being told. The woman across the aisle, a grandmother knitting a baby blanket, paused mid-stitch when she noticed Ray watching the front. "Sweetheart," the grandmother said softly, "is everything all right?" Ray forced a smile. "Everything's fine, ma'am, just stretching my legs." "Oh, good," the woman said, but her eyes lingered, studying Ray with unwelcome intuition. The plane jolted suddenly. A gasp rippled across the cabin. The sign fastened, SEATBLTS blinked on. But Ray realized something faster. That jolt wasn't turbulence. It was abrupt, mechanical, felt like someone had pulled on a cable or wrenched a panel near the cockpit. Row 11 man's head snapped up. There it is, Ray thought, trigger point. She unbuckled her seatbelt in a single practiced motion, slow enough not to alarm the passengers, but controlled enough to be ready. Her muscles screamed with memories of breaching doors at dawn, of moving through dust-choked compounds, of firing the perfect shot from a hillside 3 football fields away. But she wasn't armed now. She didn't have backup. She didn't even have a comm link. All she had were instincts and a plane full of civilians. Then Maria reappeared, but this time she didn't stop at Ray's row. She stopped at row 11. The man jolted slightly. "Sir," Maria said with forced brightness, "everything all right here?" He smiled too wide. "Yes, perfect." Ray's stomach clenched. That smile was wrong, that tone was wrong, and the timing, way too convenient. But before Ray could stand, something else happened, something she had trained for but had hoped she'd never see again. The man in row 11 reached under his seat. The motion was subtle, quick, practiced. Ray shot to her feet. The grandmother gasped. The businessman next to her whispered, "Oh God." Maria stepped back, her face draining of color. Ray's voice dropped into the tone that once made younger soldiers snap to attention. "Sir," she called quietly, "hands where I can see them." A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers froze, sensing danger without understanding it. Row 11 man looked up, eyes locking onto Ray with sharp, predatory focus. "And who exactly are you?" Ray's next words came out cold, controlled, the voice she had buried for years. "Someone who won't let this plane go down today." His lips curled. "Then you're too late." Before she could respond, he stood, swift, intentional, and moving toward the cockpit. Maria screamed. Several passengers ducked, and Ray lunged forward, heart pounding, every dormant instinct roaring awake. But before she reached him, the intercom crackled again. Only this time the captain's voice wasn't calm. It wasn't even steady. "Everyone sit down and stay still. We have a hostage situation in the cockpit. Do not approach." The cabin erupted. Ray froze mid-stride. Hostage situation. Inside the cockpit. That changed everything. The man in row 11 wasn't acting alone. Ray clenched her jaw, realizing the nightmare she had just stepped back into. And now she wasn't sure if she was early enough, or already too late. And then in the chaos she heard it, something behind her. A sound she recognized instantly. A metallic click. Too close, too deliberate. Right behind her. She turned slowly, but what she saw made her blood run cold. Someone else on that plane was standing now. And they weren't looking at row 11. They were looking at her. And they were smiling, hidden skills unleashed. The aisle felt impossibly narrow now, the air thick with fear and adrenaline. Every passenger was a potential hazard and a potential shield. The hum of the engines had turned into a low roar in Ray's ears, almost drowned out by the frantic whispers and gasps surrounding her. Row 22, once a safe little bubble of anonymity, had transformed into the epicenter of a war zone she had once trained to command. She kept her voice calm, measured, a whisper almost lost beneath the chaos, eyes on the cockpit door, now. Passengers didn't move, too stunned, too confused, but Ray didn't need them to. She only needed control of the immediate space, the aisle, the rows, the positions of the threats. The clipboard man, Victor Riznik, had recovered from her initial strike. His pen glinted ominously in his hand as he stepped forward, a predator recalibrating after being deflected. The second figure, the shadow near the rear exit, mirrored his motion. They were closing in, and Ray realized in an instant. They expected her to act aggressively, expected her to make the first fatal mistake. But she had an advantage they didn't. Years of training in environments where every inch counted, every heartbeat mattered, every microsecond determined life or death. Her hands flexed, settling into instinctual positions. She didn't reach for a weapon. They had assumed she was unarmed, but her body was her weapon. Her reflexes, honed over countless missions, had been trained to move faster than thought, strike harder than anger, and adapt more fluidly than fear. The plane jolted. A shudder rolled through the fuselage. She guessed the intruders had already tampered with secondary systems, maybe the hydraulics controlling the flaps. Another jolt could throw the aisle into chaos. Her mind raced, calculating angles, distances, and timing. Victor was 3 feet ahead of her. His partner, slightly taller, slightly broader, was 5 feet behind him, blocking access to the rear galley. Civilians were pinned to their seats, swaying violently, terrified and unaware that the danger wasn't turbulence. It was a highly trained assault team. Ray made her move. She rose slightly, subtly, letting her presence register without panic. Victor shifted, reflexively raising his pen. Ray lunged sideways, dropping low, pivoting to the side with a controlled momentum that sent him staggering backward into a seat row. He grunted, hitting the metal frame. The pen slid across the aisle, useless now. A child screamed. The grandmother grabbed her grandson and shrieked, but Ray didn't flinch. Every movement was deliberate, every action calculated. Victor recovered instantly, his muscles taut, trained. He advanced again. She twisted, swept her leg at his knee, not to cripple, only to slow him. The narrow aisle worked in her favor. He couldn't maneuver freely. Her heart pounded, but her breathing remained steady. This was rhythm. This was instinct. This was survival. The second man lunged from behind the last row. Ray pivoted mid-step, using the momentum of the first strike to deflect the incoming arm. She spun again, snapping his wrist into the metal frame of a seat. A sharp crack sounded. The man grunted, surprised by her speed and precision. Passengers shrank further into their seats, clutching each other, crying, but Ray had only one focus: neutralize the threat before they reached the cockpit. She saw the pilot's eyes peering through the cracked door, pleading. The cockpit wasn't secure. Not yet. A flash of lightning illuminated the aisle, revealing every detail. The second intruder's jacket shimmered, giving away the outline of a small firearm in his waistband. Ray's pulse accelerated. If he drew it here in this confined space, dozens could die before anyone reacted. She reacted. She dropped low, sweeping her leg forward in a calculated arc that knocked the second man off balance. He stumbled backward, hitting a tray table that toppled, sending drinks crashing to the floor. Victor moved instinctively to intercept her again. She sidestepped, pivoted, and delivered a sharp elbow into his ribs. He grunted but continued forward, trained muscle memory overriding pain. The cabin was chaos. Overhead bins rattled, passengers screamed. Some vomited in fear, others tried to crawl under seats, but Ray saw every detail, every micro-movement, every potential advantage. She reached row 23 and pivoted sharply, using a seatback to flip Victor into the aisle. His momentum carried him toward the rear of the plane, sliding across the carpeting with a grunt. She followed instantly, every step precise, calculated. The second man, recovering from her sweep, was already on his feet. She pivoted again, striking him with the heel of her palm across the chest, knocking him into the aisle. But another threat loomed above her, from the overhead bin. One of the hijackers had managed to retrieve a small tactical knife. Ray reacted in a single fluid motion. She grabbed a metal tray from the galley, swung it like a pendulum. The knife clattered to the floor. Sparks of panic reflected in the passengers' wide eyes. One man muttered, What is she?" She didn't answer. Words were useless here. Actions were everything. She sprinted forward, moving like liquid through the confined aisle, intercepting Victor as he lunged for the galley doorway. She grabbed him in a headlock, using her momentum to slam him against the wall of seats. He groaned but struggled, trying to throw her off balance. Her hand slid to his wrist, twisting just enough to force him to drop the second pen, which clattered harmlessly to the floor. He glared at her, eyes cold, calculating, realizing for the first time that this woman was not a passenger. "She's fast," he muttered, voice low, venomous. Ray didn't respond. Her gaze swept the aisle. The cockpit door was still slightly ajar. The pilot's face was pale, holding the yoke with trembling hands. The other man, Victor's partner, was recovering, inching forward slowly, weapon at the ready. She exhaled slowly, forcing control into her body. The storm outside shook the plane again, but she welcomed it. It masked her movements. It gave her a rhythm to work against. Using the confined space to her advantage, she rolled Victor forward, then kicked off the seat wall to regain her stance. The second intruder raised his gun, a small semi-automatic barrel glinting under the emergency lights. Ray didn't flinch. She lunged, grabbing his wrist in a vice-like grip and twisting, forcing him to drop the firearm. He stumbled backward into a passenger row. Several people screamed, but Ray pivoted instantly to shield them, placing herself between the civilians and the hijacker. The cockpit door rattled. The pilot shouted something inaudible over the roar of engines and storm. Ray ignored the panic, her focus razor-sharp. She was one step from the cockpit, but every movement had to be precise. One mistake and hundreds could die. Victor recovered and lunged again, but Ray anticipated it. She sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and used his momentum to slam him into the galley wall. He grunted, disoriented but not incapacitated. He was still dangerous. The second man, now disarmed, tried to rush her from the other side. Ray pivoted, delivering a swift knee to his midsection and a palm strike to his jaw. He collapsed to the floor, stunned. Silence fell for a heartbeat. The passengers froze, unsure whether to scream or move. Some stared at row 22 in awe, some in terror. She exhaled, letting the adrenaline pulse through her veins. 2 down, 1 left, Victor. She could see the tension in his eyes, the realization that his opponent was no ordinary passenger. But she wasn't finished. She moved with speed and precision, her muscles a symphony of trained instinct. Victor lunged again, desperate now, and she sidestepped, trapping his arm in a seatback. Using her momentum, she twisted, forcing him to the floor and pinning him with her knee. He struggled, grunting, but Ray's grip was iron. The cabin was quiet now, except for the storm outside and the heavy breaths of terrified passengers. Victor's eyes met hers, wide with disbelief. You're Delta," he muttered, realization dawning too late. She didn't respond. Her hand pressed to his chest, keeping him pinned while her gaze swept the aisle. The cockpit was now reachable, and the pilot's terrified eyes met hers. She whispered low, calm, "Stay down, I'll handle this. Everyone else stays seated." Passengers shifted uneasily but complied, sensing the authority radiating from row 22. And then a sound from below the cabin, metal against metal, soft but deliberate, caught her attention. Someone was moving beneath the floor panels. Another intruder, another threat. Her eyes narrowed. She realized the battle was far from over. The plane shuddered violently again, jolting everyone in their seats. The storm outside raged. Lightning illuminated the aisle, revealing the tiny, desperate expressions of passengers too stunned to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around them. Ray's pulse steadied. She didn't flinch. She had one objective now: secure the cockpit, neutralize Victor, and prevent whatever sabotage was happening below from unfolding. Every muscle, every thought, every trained reflex aligned. Row 22 had transformed into a battlefield. And Ray was no longer just a passenger, the cockpit and the hidden saboteur. Ray's gaze swept the cabin again, calculating the final moves. Victor Riznik was still pinned beneath her knee, grunting, muscles straining in a desperate attempt to free himself. His partner lay dazed on the aisle floor, clutching his jaw, but even in that daze, Ray knew he could recover in seconds. One wrong move now, and the lives of nearly 200 civilians could be lost. She took a slow, steadying breath and turned her attention to the cockpit. The door had been ajar just enough for her to see the pilot's white-knuckled grip on the controls. His eyes, wide, pleading, met hers. She nodded once, a silent command, "Trust me." Every step down the aisle was measured. She couldn't afford panic, couldn't afford hesitation. Her boots pressed lightly against the carpet, almost soundless. Every passenger seemed frozen, some still terrified, some still unaware, but all eyes had started drifting toward the motion at row 22. As she neared the cockpit, she caught a subtle movement from beneath the floor panels near the rear of the galley. A faint shadow scuttled. Metal scraped against metal. A sabotage attempt. Someone was trying to access the avionics bay, possibly to override flight controls. Her mind raced. Time was running out. If the plane's systems were compromised mid-storm, they'd be flying blind, and thousands of feet over the Atlantic, blind meant death. Without hesitation, Ray dropped low, knees bent, moving toward the galley to confront the hidden threat. The panel beneath the rear floor groaned as someone attempted to lift it further. She grabbed the edge, yanked it open, and revealed a man lying flat, face hidden beneath a tactical mask. He froze when he saw her. Ray's hand flew to his wrist, twisting and forcing a small electronic device he was holding to clatter onto the floor. Sparks ignited briefly, an ominous warning of what could have been. "You won't be doing that anymore," she said calmly, voice even, deadly. The man lunged. Reflexes honed over years in hostile environments kicked in. Ray pivoted, using his momentum against him, slamming him into the bulkhead. He grunted, scrambled to his feet, and reached again for the panel. She spun, grabbed him, and forced him down onto the floor, pinning him with a knee to his back. At that exact moment, the storm outside surged, tossing the plane violently. Drinks spilled, people screamed, and overhead bins rattled. Ray didn't flinch. She never flinched. Behind her, the aisle was tense. Victor was still pinned, and his partner was slowly recovering. They had regrouped faster than she had anticipated. She rose slightly, scanning the cockpit again. The pilot looked like a man about to break, but he obeyed her subtle gestures. The other intruder at the rear, the man she'd pinned, was restrained enough for now, but she knew he would fight again if given a chance. Lightning flashed. Ray's eyes caught movement in the shadowed aisle. Someone had slipped past a distracted flight attendant, inching toward the cockpit. Without thinking, Ray moved. In one fluid motion, she spun around, elbowed the intruder backward into a seat, and swept him off his feet. He hit the aisle with a thud, groaning before scrambling to rise again. She turned back, heart pounding, and saw the man beneath the floor panel trying to wriggle free. "Stay down," she commanded. Her voice was quiet, calm, but every syllable carried lethal authority. The man froze, fear now evident in his posture. Ray didn't wait. She forced him to the side, securing him under the galley wall with a rope from the emergency kit. Her fingers moved quickly, tying precise knots that would hold him until the plane landed. Breathing steadily, Ray assessed the cockpit. The pilot had begun stabilizing the plane, struggling with the sudden turbulence and the storm outside. Ray approached the door, her hand ready to push it open. Then she saw it. The second intruder had regained partial footing, hand reaching into a jacket. She knew immediately it wasn't a gun. It was a small tactical device, a detonator of some sort. Lightning flashed, time slowed. Ray lunged forward, intercepting him with a shoulder strike that sent him tumbling backward. He hit the floor hard, groaning, and she quickly rolled him into a seat, trapping his arms. Finally, with the immediate threats neutralized, Ray opened the cockpit door fully. Inside, the pilot's hands shook on the yoke. Instruments flickered under the storm's assault, some already damaged by the earlier sabotage attempts. He looked at her, desperation and relief warring in his eyes. Can you fly us out of this?" he stammered. Ray smiled faintly. "You've got the controls, I just make sure we get there alive." Lightning illuminated the cabin again, revealing the aftermath. Passengers were beginning to understand the chaos that had unfolded. Some were staring in disbelief at the young woman in row 22, now clearly no ordinary passenger. Ray's eyes swept the cabin, noting injuries, minor, mostly bruises and cuts from falling objects. She checked the intruders, all three incapacitated, secured, none able to continue. She exhaled. But the storm outside raged, reminding her that their danger wasn't over. Then a new sound reached her ears, a faint beep from the rear cargo area, one of the sabotage devices they hadn't found yet. Ray didn't hesitate. She moved toward the back, commanding passengers to stay seated. Flight attendants obeyed immediately, sensing her authority. The cargo hold was cramped, dark, filled with luggage and shadows. Ray could see the device clearly now, a small electronic panel rigged to the main avionics bus. She knelt quickly, scanning the wiring. Every second counted. One wrong touch and the plane could lose all systems mid-flight. Her hands moved with surgical precision, cutting wires, rerouting circuits, stabilizing the device. Sweat dripped down her face, but her movements didn't falter. Her entire training compressed into these critical moments. The device was neutralized just as the storm jolted the plane violently again. She rose, breath steady, and checked the cabin one last time. All intruders were secured, all threats neutralized. Ray returned to row 22, catching the pilot's eye. A nod passed between them, a silent acknowledgement. They were alive. Passengers were still shaken, some crying, some staring in awe. Many whispered among themselves, asking, who was this woman? How had she done what seemed impossible? Ray didn't answer. She sank back into her seat, pretending to adjust her travel pillow. She let the storm outside pass, letting the adrenaline recede slowly. But as she exhaled, she realized something chilling. The messages on the devices the intruders had carried weren't just random. They had been sent from someone high up, someone powerful, someone with access to Delta Force intelligence. Her instinct screamed, this wasn't over. She glanced at Viktor Riznik, who was restrained and bruised in the aisle. His eyes met hers, cold, calculating, alive, still dangerous. She knew the next move wasn't on this plane. It was somewhere far bigger, somewhere she wasn't ready to face yet. And as the storm began to fade outside, Ray understood the terrifying truth. The flight had been just the beginning. Part 6 ends with tension, a hint of larger stakes, and suspense about who orchestrated the attack and what the next target might be. The mastermind revealed. Ray sank back into her seat, fingers still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, though she forced her expression into the calm, tired traveler facade. Around her, passengers began murmuring, checking on each other, whispering questions she couldn't answer. Some glanced at the subdued intruders in disbelief. One man, a father in row 20, whispered, Who are you?" Ray didn't answer. Names, identities, histories, they were luxuries she didn't have anymore. Right now, the only thing that mattered was survival, understanding the bigger picture, and ensuring that this nightmare didn't continue on the ground. Her mind raced. Viktor Riznik and his partners hadn't acted alone. The devices, the timing, the precision, it all pointed to someone with deep access, someone who could reach Delta Force intelligence. That wasn't just a threat, it was an intelligence nightmare. Her gaze shifted to the cockpit. The pilot had stabilized the plane, shaking but in control. The storm had abated slightly, leaving a trail of ominous gray clouds streaking across the horizon. Ray rose carefully, motioning to him to remain seated but to stay on course. She approached Viktor, kneeling down slightly to meet his eyes. "You didn't act alone," she said softly. Her voice carried no malice, only authority. "Someone orchestrated this. Who?" Viktor sneered, his expression a mix of defiance and amusement. "Do you think I reveal my master plan to a Delta Force ghost?" His words were chilling. "You can't stop what's coming, not even you." Ray's eyes narrowed. He was trying to provoke her, to distract her, but she remained unflinching. She had seen worse, she had faced worse, and she had survived. Her attention shifted back to the rear. The second intruder was conscious now, squirming slightly in the restraints she had secured. She kept a hand near him, ready to prevent any sudden movement. Then her phone vibrated in her pocket, a secure line she hadn't expected anyone to have. She glanced at it quickly, seeing a cryptic message. "Good work, Agent Hale, but it was never just a flight. Meet at coordinates, midnight. Everything unfolds there." Her stomach dropped. Whoever had orchestrated this was already 2 steps ahead. This wasn't a hijacking for ransom. It was part of a far larger plan, one that could have consequences far beyond a single aircraft. The pilot cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but thank you. I don't think we'd have made it if you hadn't." Ray gave a small nod, interrupting him. "Keep flying. We're not out of danger yet." Her gaze drifted over the cabin again. The passengers, traumatized but alive, were still unaware of the scale of what had just occurred. She wondered how many of them would ever truly understand the nightmare they had survived, or the woman who had silently saved them all. Her mind replayed the movements of the intruders, the devices, the subtle signals that passed between them. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. Someone was using these operatives as pawns, testing security, probing weaknesses, and watching the outcomes. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. The first step was ensuring everyone survived this flight. The second step, finding the mastermind. A sudden jolt from the plane made everyone gasp. The storm had not passed completely, and turbulence still rocked the cabin. Ray gritted her teeth. Flying a plane in stormy skies was one thing. Flying a plane while dealing with highly trained, deadly operatives and potential sabotage, that was something else entirely. She returned her attention to Victor. Even restrained, his gaze never left hers. She could feel the intelligence behind his eyes, the strategic thinking, the anticipation, the attempt to predict her next move. "You're going to tell me everything," she said quietly, "and not a word more, or I'll make sure your silence is permanent." Victor smirked faintly. "I may be bound, but my friends are still free. You may have survived today, but the real game hasn't started yet." Her jaw tightened. He wasn't bluffing. That cryptic phone message confirmed it. This flight had been a test, a warning, and a distraction all at once. Suddenly, the aircraft shuddered violently again. Ray's instinct screamed. She spun toward the rear. Someone had tampered with the secondary control panel again, attempting another breach. The man she had pinned under the galley groaned, struggling against the restraints. In one fluid motion, Ray lunged, securing the struggling man while simultaneously kicking the panel closed to prevent further access. Sparks flew briefly, illuminating the horror on the passengers' faces. The cabin was chaotic, and yet Ray moved with precision, almost as if the world slowed around her. The storm outside began to relent slightly, but the tension inside the aircraft was far from over. Ray scanned the remaining threats, calculated the angles, and assessed the vulnerabilities. Her gaze returned to the cockpit. The pilot was handling the controls with growing confidence, but Ray knew he could only maintain it for so long. The plane itself was structurally intact, but the sabotage attempts indicated someone had far more knowledge than an ordinary criminal. She approached the cockpit, signaling the pilot to keep steady. Her movements were deliberate, commanding, but she also had to be quick. The next steps would determine the safety of everyone aboard. Victor's gaze followed her, calculating, anticipating. He may have underestimated her initially, but now he understood her capabilities. That understanding made him dangerous in a different way, more cautious, more deliberate, more lethal if given the chance. Ray's mind raced. Whoever orchestrated this, whoever had the access and intelligence to coordinate such a complex operation, was dangerous, not just today but beyond. She glanced at her phone again. The coordinates in the message pulsed in her mind: midnight, a location, the next move. Her eyes scanned the cabin one last time, making sure everyone was secure, every intruder restrained. Then she turned toward the cockpit. The storm outside was clearing, revealing dark clouds and flashes of fading lightning. The pilot glanced at her, trusting her implicitly. Ray exhaled slowly. She had survived the immediate threat, neutralized the hijackers, and ensured the passengers were safe. But the real danger, the orchestrator behind this, was still out there, watching, waiting, planning the next move. And Ray knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to wait for them to strike next. The aircraft leveled, engines roaring steadily now. Passengers whispered nervously, beginning to understand that their lives had been saved by a stranger with skills they couldn't comprehend. Ray returned to her seat, settling in with an air of calm that belied the storm still raging in her mind. The adrenaline was still coursing, but her focus was sharp. She checked Victor one last time. His smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. He was thinking, planning, waiting. She tapped a coded message into her secure phone. Someone needed to know what had just happened. Someone needed to prepare for the next move. The plane was no longer just a vehicle. It was a battlefield, a test, and a message. Ray exhaled. The storm outside had cleared, but inside the tension was far from over. The mastermind behind the hijacking had been revealed, at least in part, and the game had only just begun. She leaned back, hands folded, eyes scanning the cabin. Row 22 had once again become her command center, and she was ready. Because one thing was certain: The person who orchestrated this wasn't just after chaos, they were after her. And Ray Hale never ran from a fight, the landing and the aftermath. Ray Hale didn't move immediately after securing the last intruder. She sank into her seat just long enough to let her muscles relax, her mind working 100 steps ahead. The passengers were alive. The intruders were restrained. The devices had been neutralized. And yet the tension in the cabin hadn't dissipated, it had only shifted. It now hung in the air like a low fog, thick with realization. The danger wasn't gone. The pilot, still shaking, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say. We've never, thank you." His words stumbled, disbelief evident in every syllable. Ray gave him a faint, almost imperceptible nod, then stood. The aisle was still strewn with overturned trays, spilled coffee, and the remnants of chaos, but everyone was alive. She moved toward Victor Riznik first, dragging him gently upright while keeping the pressure of control in her posture. He glared at her, chest heaving, but made no sound. For the first time he seemed almost human. The storm outside had passed, leaving streaks of moonlight slicing across the cabin. Ray's gaze swept past the wreckage of a near tragedy, landing on the passengers. Fear, gratitude, and awe shimmered in their eyes. She didn't smile. There was no time for relief yet. Ray motioned to the flight attendants. "Check for injuries. Keep everyone calm. No one moves until we're on the ground." They nodded, snapping into action, their professionalism shining through despite trembling hands. Her focus shifted to Victor again. He still had connections, knowledge, and experience that could be lethal if allowed to escape. She checked the restraints one last time, ensuring they were secure. His smirk was gone, replaced by a calculating glare. He knew his mission had failed, but he was alive, and that made him even more dangerous. As the plane began its descent, Ray's eyes never left the cockpit. The pilot was working hard to keep the aircraft level, and she gave him silent guidance, subtle hand gestures and shifts in weight to communicate adjustments. The last traces of the storm rattled the plane, but the worst was over. Passengers whispered among themselves, some clutching hands, some crying quietly, some just staring in stunned silence. A little girl in row 23 peeked at Ray, wide-eyed. Her mother whispered something under her breath, but Ray caught the look, a mixture of awe and disbelief. She gave the girl a gentle nod, her expression calm but firm. The intercom crackled, and a calm voice replaced the pilot's tense instructions. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated, fasten your seatbelts, and prepare for arrival." Ray exhaled. The landing wasn't going to be glamorous. The plane had taken a beating, but it was stable enough. Still, the moment the wheels hit the tarmac, she would need to act fast to ensure the intruders didn't escape. And she knew the mastermind behind this operation was already planning their next move. Whoever orchestrated the hijacking had used highly trained operatives, sabotage devices, and the element of fear to their advantage. But now, they would have to face her fully awake, fully aware, and fully prepared. The runway lights stretched ahead, a glowing ribbon in the darkness. Ray's pulse synchronized with the engine's roar, calculating approach speed, weight distribution, wind gusts. The plane touched down with a controlled, jarring thud, skidding slightly on the wet tarmac. Passengers gasped, gripping armrests, praying silently. Ray's eyes remained on Victor and his partner, ensuring neither moved until emergency personnel arrived. The brakes engaged, the aircraft slowed, and the emergency slides were deployed. Rescue teams and law enforcement personnel rushed the plane, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Passengers began to evacuate, guided carefully by flight attendants and officers. Ray stayed low, her presence commanding authority, ensuring no one panicked. Victor's partner tried a last move, attempting to reach for a concealed knife. Ray reacted instantly, twisting his wrist and forcing him to the ground with minimal force. Law enforcement moved in immediately, securing him further. Victor, realizing the futility of resistance, remained silent, eyes fixed on Ray. As the last passenger exited, Ray finally allowed herself to stand fully, scanning the runway. Media helicopters had already started circling, lights blinking. Emergency vehicles were everywhere, their sirens muted by the distant storm but their presence undeniable. A black SUV waited near the perimeter of the tarmac. Ray's phone vibrated, another message from the cryptic mastermind. Impressive, but the game isn't over. Midnight. Coordinates unchanged. Be ready. She felt the familiar surge of tension, adrenaline mixed with the understanding that this was only the first act. The hijacking, the sabotage, the near catastrophe, it had all been orchestrated as a message. Ray scanned the crowd of emergency personnel and passengers. Many were shaking, tears streaking their faces, but all were alive. They had survived what seemed impossible. She felt a fleeting sense of pride but pushed it aside immediately. There was no room for celebration yet. Law enforcement approached her, cautious but aware that she had been instrumental in saving the passengers. She gave a concise report, her tone firm and exacting, revealing only what was necessary. Victor Riznik and his accomplices were secured. Evidence of the sabotage devices was collected. The plane was safe, and the passengers had survived. But Ray's mind was already calculating the next steps. Midnight. The coordinates. Whoever had orchestrated this operation was expecting her to respond, to be drawn out, to react, and she would, not recklessly but strategically. As she prepared to leave the tarmac, she looked back at the aircraft one last time. The storm clouds had cleared, but the remnants of chaos remained inside. Overturned trays, bruised passengers, minor injuries, and 3 highly trained operatives now restrained. It was a battlefield, and she had emerged victorious. Yet she knew one chilling truth. The mastermind hadn't been revealed entirely, and the threat was far from over. Victor's warning echoed in her mind. The real game hasn't started yet. Her hand rested on the side of the black SUV, her expression steely. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the one who could prevent the next attack, uncover the mastermind, and ensure that no one else would fall victim to their plans. And as the helicopter lights of the media hovered above, capturing every moment, Ray Hale stepped into the night, determined, focused, and ready for the confrontation that awaited her at midnight. The passengers watched her go, some whispering her name, some simply in awe. They had witnessed bravery, skill, and precision they could hardly comprehend. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know the larger threat. But one thing was certain. Row 22 had been the center of something extraordinary. Ray Hale's journey was far from over. The storm had passed, but the real battle, the one she had been trained for, the one she could never escape, was only beginning.